The cards felt cold in Samuel Carter's weathered hands as he stared across the smoky saloon at the man who had just changed his life forever. The stranger, greasy, thin fellow with shifty eyes, had laid down 3 aces with a trembling hand. Certain he'd won the biggest pot Willow Creek had ever seen, but Samuel's 4 kings lay spread across the scarred wooden table like fallen soldiers. The silence that followed was deafening. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered old Pete from behind the bar, his voice cutting through the hush that had settled over the saloon like morning fog. Samuel hadn't meant for things to go this far. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. But when he'd heard the stranger bragging about his property, talking about a woman like she was livestock's, something dark and protective had stirred in Samuel's chest. The stranger, who'd introduced himself as Vernon Grimsby, had been drinking heavily and losing badly all night. First his horse, then his wagon, then his gold watch that had belonged to his father. With each loss, his desperation had grown more palpable, his bets more reckless. And then he'd done the unthinkable. "I got something better than money," Grimsby had slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey and defeat. "Got me a wife, young pretty, carrying my child, worth more than all the gold in California." The saloon had fallen silent then, even the piano player stopping mid-song. Men didn't bet their wives in poker games, not decent men, anyway. But Grimsby wasn't decent, and everyone in that room knew it. Samuel should have walked away, should have taken his winnings, and headed back to his lonely ranch in the hills. But something in the stranger's tone, the casual cruelty, the way he spoke of a pregnant woman as if she were chattel to be traded, had made Samuel's blood run cold. "You're talking about a human being," Samuel had said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled anger. Grimsby had laughed, a harsh sound that grated against Samuel's ears. "She ain't nothing but trouble anyway. Been nothing but mouthy and ungrateful since I married her. Maybe a new man can teach her some respect." That's when Samuel had made his decision. He'd pushed every dollar he owned into the center of the table, his entire winter's savings, money he'd planned to use for new cattle and repairs to his ranch. "Gall," he'd said simply. Now, staring at the cards that had sealed both their fates, Samuel felt the weight of what he'd just done settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Somewhere in this godforsaken town was a pregnant woman, would just become his responsibility, whether she wanted to be or not. Grimsby's face had gone pale as fresh milk. "No," he whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for the cards as if he could somehow change what they revealed. "No, this ain't right. I demand another hand." "Game's over," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. He gathered his winnings, what little money there was, and stood. "Where is she?" "Now hold on just a minute." Samuel's hand moved to rest on the butt of his Colt, and Grimsby's protest died in his throat. "I asked you a question." "The boarding house," Grimsby mumbled, suddenly very interested in the bottom of his empty whiskey glass. "Room 12, upstairs. But I'm warning you, she's got a mouth on her and a temper to match." Samuel nodded curtly and headed for the door, the eyes of every man in the saloon following his movement. He could hear the whispers starting already by morning. The entire town would know that Samuel Carter had won Vernon, Grimsby's wife, in a poker game. The boarding house stood at the end of Main Street, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and one of the shutters hung at an odd angle, but it was clean enough. Samuel climbed the narrow stairs, his boots echoing in the empty hallway. Room 12 was at the end of the hall. Samuel stood before the door for a long moment, trying to find the right words for what he was about to say. How did a man tell a woman that her husband had gambled her away like a piece of property? How did he explain that she now belonged to a stranger? He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What kind of man was he really? He told himself he'd done it to save her from Grimsby's cruelty. But was he any better? Taking possession of a woman like she was a prize to be claimed? Before he could lose his nerve, Samuel knocked gently on the door. "Go away, Vernon," came a voice from inside, soft but weary, with an edge of steel that suggested its owner had been pushed too far too many times. "I told you I don't want to see you tonight." Ma'am, Samuel said carefully, my name is Samuel Carter. I need to speak. With you about your husband? There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps crossing the room. The door opened just a crack, revealing a single green eye and a strand of auburn hair. Who are you? The woman asked, suspicion clear in her voice. Samuel removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. Like I said, ma'am, I'm Samuel Carter. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here, and I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your husband. The door opened wider, revealing a young woman who couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, with delicate features and skin that should have been porcelain smooth but was marred by a yellowing bruise along her left cheek. Her dress was simple but well made, and her hand rested protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, but it was her eyes that caught Samuel's attention. They held a wariness that spoke of too much pain, too much betrayal. This was a woman who had learned not to trust easily. What's happened? She asked, and Samuel could hear the fear creeping into her voice, despite her attempts to sound calm. Samuel took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say this. Ma'am, your husband lost you in a poker game tonight. The legal ownership papers. They're mine now. The woman stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a bitter kind of resignation that broke Samuel's heart. Of course he did, she said quietly, one hand moving to rest against the doorframe, as if she needed the support. I should have known it would come to this eventually. Ma'am, Catherine, she said automatically. Catherine Grimsby. Though I suppose that name doesn't mean much anymore, does it? Samuel felt something twist in his chest at the defeated tone in her voice. Mrs. Grimsby, I want you to know that I didn't seek this situation out. I saw the way your husband was talking about you, and I couldn't let him trade you off to just anyone who might not treat you with the respect you deserve. Catherine let out a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. Respect, Mr. Carter? I'm a woman who just got wagered away like a prize heifer. Respect stopped being part of my life the day I made the mistake of marrying Vernon Grimsby. She stepped back from the door, gesturing for him to enter. The room was small and spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. Catherine's few possessions were packed neatly in a worn carpet bag on the bed. I suppose you're here to collect your winnings, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. Ma'am, it's not like that. I know how this must look, but I want you to understand what I understand, Catherine interrupted, turning to face him with fire suddenly blazing in those green eyes. Is that I've gone from being the property of one man to being the property of another. The only question now is whether you're going to be better or worse than my husband. Ex-husband, Samuel corrected quietly. Catherine's eyebrows rose. Excuse me? Legally speaking, when a man loses his wife in a poker game, the marriage is dissolved. You're not Mrs. Grimsby anymore? For the first time since he'd knocked on her door, Catherine looked genuinely surprised. I didn't know that. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his hat still in his hands. Ma'am, I need you to understand something. I didn't win you because I wanted a wife. I won you because I couldn't stand the thought of Vernon Grimsby trading you off to God knows who. But that doesn't mean I have any intention of treating you like property. Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Then what do you intend, Mr. Carter? I have a ranch, Samuel said carefully. It's not much, just a small spread in the hills, but it's peaceful and safe. You could stay there if you want. Until you figure out what you want to do next. What would you expect in return? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the implications neither of them wanted to voice. Samuel met her gaze steadily. Nothing, he said simply. You'd have your own room, your own space. I'd ask nothing of you except maybe help with cooking and cleaning if you're willing. But if you're not, that's fine too. Catherine stared at him as if he'd just spoken in a foreign language. You're telling me you'd take me to your ranch, provide for me and my child, and expect nothing in return? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Why? The word came out sharp and suspicious. What man does something like that without expecting ... something? Samuel was quiet for a moment, thinking of his own empty house, the silence that greeted him. Every evening when he came in from working the ranch, He thought of the dreams he'd once had of filling that house with laughter and love. Dreams that had died 3 years ago with a woman named Margaret who'd chosen a banker from San Antonio over a lonely rancher. Maybe, he said finally, because I know what it's like to have nowhere else to go. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Catherine's defensive posture softened slightly. And if I say no, if I choose to stay here in town, I'll wish you well, and you'll never see me again, Samuel said. The choice is yours, Catherine. It's your choice to make. Catherine. Not Mrs. Grimsby, not the woman I won. Her name spoken with respect and kindness. When was the last time Vernon had used her name like that? She walked to the window, looking out at the darkened street below. Samuel could see her reflection in the glass, the careful way she held herself, the protective hand over her belly, the exhaustion that seemed to weigh her down like a physical burden. How do I know you're telling the truth? She asked without turning around. How do I know you won't change your mind once we're alone on your ranch? You don't, Samuel admitted. All I can give you is my word, and I know that probably doesn't mean much coming from a stranger. But Catherine, I swear to you on my mother's grave that I will never lay a hand on you in anger or force you to do anything against your will. Catherine turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your mother's grave? Why, she died when I was 15, Samuel said quietly. Fever took her one winter. She was the kindest woman I ever knew, and she raised me to believe that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can't protect themselves. And you think I can't protect myself? Samuel looked pointedly at the bruise on her cheek, and Catherine's hand moved involuntarily to cover it. I think, Samuel said gently, that you've been protecting yourself for a long time, and you're tired. I think you're carrying a child who deserves better than what Vernon Grimsby could provide. And I think maybe we could help each other. Help each other how? Samuel hesitated, then decided on honesty. My ranch is falling apart, Catherine. I'm a good rancher, but I'm not much of a housekeeper. The place needs a woman's touch. Needs. Life breathed back into it. And you need a safe place to have your baby and figure out what comes next. Catherine was quiet for a long time, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. Finally, she spoke. If I come with you and I'm not saying I will, but if I do, I want your word that when I'm ready to leave, you won't try to stop me. You have it, and I want to know about this ranch of yours. How far from town? How many hands do you employ? Do you have neighbors? Samuel smiled slightly at her practical questions. Vernon Grimsby might have been a fool, but he'd married a smart woman. It's about 10 miles north, up in the foothills. Beautiful country rolling hills, good water, plenty of grass for the cattle. I run it alone mostly, though. I hire help during branding season. My nearest neighbor is the Hendricks family, about 5 miles east. Good people. And the house. 2 bedrooms, kitchen, sitting room. Nothing fancy, but it's solid and warm. Work, but it's livable. Catherine nodded, filing away the information. One more question, Mr. Carter? Yes. Why aren't you married? A man with his own ranch at your age. There must be a reason. Samuel felt the familiar ache in his chest. That came whenever he thought of Margaret. There was someone once. She decided she preferred life in the city to life on a ranch. I'm sorry, don't be. Turned out she wasn't the woman I thought she was. Catherine studied his face, and Samuel had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him. All right, she said finally. I'll come with you. But Mr. Carter, Samuel, I wanted understood that this is a temporary arrangement. I'm not looking for a husband, and I'm not looking for romance. I just need time to figure out my next move. It's understood completely. Catherine nodded and moved to her carpet bag. I don't have much, but what I have is packed. When did you want to leave? We could leave tonight if you want, Samuel said. Get you away from here before Grimsby sobers up and starts having second thoughts about the game. For the first time since he'd met her, Catherine smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her entire face. I think that sounds like an excellent idea. The ride to Samuel's ranch took 2 hours through moonlit hills that rolled away into darkness on either side of the narrow trail. Catherine rode beside him on the horse he'd bought from the livery stable, her few possessions tied behind his saddle. She was quiet for most of the journey, but Samuel could feel her watching him, still trying to decide if she'd made the right choice. As they crested the final hill, Samuel's ranch spread out below them in the valley, a modest house with smoke. Rising from the chimney, he'd banked the fire before leaving for town. Sturdy barn and corrals that held his small herd of cattle. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd worked hard to build it from nothing. "It's beautiful," Catherine said softly, and Samuel felt a surge of pride. "It's home," he said simply. They rode down into the valley. Samuel helped Catherine down from her horse with careful hands, mindful of her condition. She stood for a moment in the moonlight, one hand pressed to her back, the other cradling her belly. "How far along are you?" Samuel asked gently. "About 6 months," Catherine replied. "The baby should come sometime in late spring." Samuel nodded, already planning. They'd need to prepare one of the bedrooms as a nursery, and he'd have to make sure Doc Patterson from town knew about Catherine's situation in case there were complications. "Let me show you the house," he said, taking her bag and leading her to the front door. The inside of the house was clean but sparse functional furniture. Bare walls, nothing that spoke of comfort or warmth. Catherine looked around with the eye of a woman who understood how to make a house into a home. "It's very practical," she said diplomatically. Samuel laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "That's one way to put it, I'm afraid. I'm not much for decoration. Lucky for you, I am." Catherine moved to the fireplace, running her fingers along the mantel. "This could be beautiful with the right touches." "You don't have to," Samuel began, but Catherine cut him off. "Samuel, if I'm going to be living here, even temporarily, I'm going to make it livable. I can't stand bare walls and empty rooms." Something warm unfurled in Samuel's chest at the thought of his house filled with Catherine's touches, but he pushed the feeling away. She'd made it clear this was temporary, and he had no right to hope for more. "Your room is this way," he said, leading her down a short hallway to the larger of the 2 bedrooms. "I put fresh sheets on the bed this morning, and there's a washstand and dresser for your things." Catherine stepped into the room and looked around. It was simple but comfortable, with a large window that would let in morning light and a view of the hills beyond. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him. "Samuel, I know this is strange for both of us. I want you to know I'm grateful for what you're doing. You don't need to thank me, Catherine. Like I said, maybe we're helping each other." She nodded, suddenly looking very tired. The events of the day were catching up with her, and Samuel could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. "I'll let you get some rest," he said, backing toward the door. "If you need anything during the night, my room is just down the hall. Don't hesitate to wake me. Good night, Samuel." "Good night, Catherine." Samuel closed the door softly and made his way to his own room, but sleep was a long time coming. He lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch, the soft lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the trees, the creak of the house settling around them. But tonight, there were new sounds too. The soft footsteps of a woman moving around in the room next door. The gentle murmur of a voice he realized was Catherine talking to her unborn child. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel's house didn't feel empty. The next few weeks fell into a routine that surprised them both with its easy comfort. Catherine proved to be everything she'd promised: practical, hardworking, and possessed of an almost magical ability to transform Samuel's austere house into something that actually felt like a home. She hung curtains in the windows, simple ones sewn from fabric she'd found in town on their weekly supply runs. She planted herbs in a small garden behind the house and coaxed vegetables from the previously neglected patch of earth. She filled the empty rooms with the sense of fresh bread and stew and the sound of humming as she worked. Samuel found himself looking forward to coming in from the range each evening, knowing that Catherine would be waiting with a hot meal and conversation that eased the loneliness he'd grown so accustomed to. He'd forgotten it was there. But more than that, he found himself watching Catherine bloom like a flower finally given proper soil and sunlight. The bruise on her cheek faded, and color returned to her skin. She gained weight that she clearly needed, and her smile, when it came, was no longer tentative, cautious, but genuine and warm. The only shadow on their peaceful existence was the baby. She carried not because Samuel didn't welcome the child, but because Catherine grew quieter and more withdrawn as her pregnancy progressed. He caught her sometimes standing at the window, one hand on her belly, staring out at the hills with an expression of profound sadness. One evening in early December, as the first snow of winter began to dust the mountains, Samuel found Catherine, standing on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl and looking up at the stars. "Cold night to be outside," he said gently, joining her. "I couldn't sleep," Catherine admitted. "The baby's been active tonight." As if to prove her point, Samuel saw her dress move as the child shifted inside her. Without thinking, he asked, "May I?" Catherine looked surprised, then nodded. Samuel placed his hand gently on her belly and immediately felt the strong kick of tiny feet against his palm. "Strong little one," he murmured, wonder in his voice. "Too strong sometimes," Catherine said with a rueful smile. "I think this child is going to be a handful." They stood together in comfortable silence, Samuel's hand still resting on Catherine's belly, both of them marveling at the life growing between them. It was an intimate moment, perhaps too intimate for two people who were supposed to be nothing more than housemates, but neither of them pulled away. "Catherine," Samuel said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy about?" "The baby. I know the circumstances aren't ideal, but—" Catherine was quiet for so long that Samuel wondered if he'd overstepped. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I love this baby more than life itself," she said. "But Samuel, I'm terrified. What kind of mother am I going to be? What kind of life can I give a child? I've no money, no family, no home of my own. This baby deserves so much better than what I can provide. Catherine, look at me." Samuel gently turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're going to be a wonderful mother. I've watched you these past weeks the way you care for everything around you, the way you've brought life back to this place. Any child would be lucky to have you." Tears glittered in Catherine's eyes. "You don't understand, Vernon. Vernon said terrible things about this baby. Said it was a burden, a mistake. What if he was right?" Samuel felt anger flare in his chest at the thought of Vernon Grimsby's cruelty, but he kept his voice gentle. "Catherine, Vernon Grimsby was a fool and a coward who didn't deserve you or the gift you're carrying. This baby isn't a mistake. This baby is a miracle. How can you say that?" "You don't even know if it's—" Catherine stopped abruptly, her hand flying to cover her mouth, as if she could take back words that had already escaped. Samuel stared at her, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed suddenly clicking into place. "Catherine, is this baby Vernon's?" Catherine's face crumpled and she turned away from him, but Samuel gently caught her chin and made her meet his eyes. "The truth, Catherine, is Vernon the father of your child?" She whispered, the word barely audible. "No, he's not." Samuel felt the world shift around him, then who? Catherine pulled away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could somehow protect herself from his judgment. "His name was David," she said quietly. "David Morrison. He was ... he was everything Vernon wasn't. Kind, gentle, loving. We were going to be married. What happened to him? He died." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if Catherine had told this story so many times she'd worn all the feeling out of it. "Pneumonia, last winter. We were engaged, but we hadn't. We hadn't married yet when I discovered I was carrying his child." Samuel felt his heart break for the pain in her voice, but he needed to understand. "So you married Vernon?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "My father arranged it. When he found out about the baby, he was furious. Said I'd disgraced the family name. Vernon was a friend of his, or so he claimed. He promised my father he'd marry me and give the baby a name, save our family's reputation, and Vernon knew the child wasn't his. Of course he knew. But my father paid him well for the privilege of marrying his fallen daughter." Catherine's voice was thick with self-loathing. I was so lost in grief, so desperate to give my baby a father's name that I agreed to it. Biggest mistake of my life. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Catherine stood rigid beside him, waiting for his judgment, his rejection. Instead, he asked the question that mattered most.
outrage.
Did you love him, David? With all my heart, Catherine whispered. He was my whole world. Then this baby isn't a mistake. Catherine, this baby is the last piece of the man you loved, a gift he left behind for you. How could that ever be anything but precious? Catherine turned to stare at him, tears streaming down her face. You're not disgusted? You don't think I'm a fallen woman who got what she deserved? Samuel reached up to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks. Catherine, I think you're a woman who loved deeply and lost everything and then found the courage to survive anyway. Think you're brave and strong and everything this baby needs you to be. But I lied to you. I let you think Vernon was the father. You protected yourself and your child the only way you knew how. I understand that. Catherine stared at him in wonder. How are you so kind? How do you make me feel like maybe I'm not? Completely broken? Samuel's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. Because you're not broken, Catherine. You're healing. And sometimes healing takes time. They stood together in the snowy silence, and Samuel felt something shift between them, a deepening of trust, of understanding, of something that felt dangerously close to love. But Catherine had loved once and lost everything. Samuel had been abandoned by a woman who found his dreams inadequate. Neither of them was ready to risk their hearts again. Not yet. Winter deepened around them. And with it, Catherine's pregnancy advanced. By January, she was moving carefully, one hand always pressed to her back, the other cradling her substantial belly. Samuel watched her with growing concern and protective tenderness that he tried to hide but failed at completely. Dr. Patterson made the trip out to the ranch twice a month to check on Catherine, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and strong. But Samuel could see the fear that crept into Catherine's eyes as her due date approached. One snowy evening in late February, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Catherine suddenly gasped and doubled over, her hand pressed to her belly. Catherine. Samuel was at her side in an instant, his arm around her shoulders. What's wrong, I think? ... Catherine panted, her face pale with pain. I think it might be time. Samuel felt panic rise in his throat. The baby wasn't due for another month, and Dr. Patterson was in town 20 miles away through snow that was still falling heavily. Are you sure? He asked, helping Catherine to the couch. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and Catherine cried out. Yes, she gasped. Samuel, I'm scared. It's going to be okay, Samuel said, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. I'm going to take care of you, Catherine, I promise. The next 12 hours were the longest of Samuel's life. He did everything he could remember, from helping with difficult births among his cattle boiling water, gathering clean cloths, trying to keep Catherine comfortable as her labor progressed. Catherine was braver than any woman had a right to be, biting back her cries of pain and trying to smile reassuringly at Samuel, even as sweat beaded on her forehead and her hands gripped the bedsheets until her knuckles were white. Samuel, she gasped during a brief respite between contractions. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Samuel said firmly, bathing her face with a cool cloth. But if it does, promise me you'll take care of the baby. Promise me you won't let them go to an orphanage. Samuel took her hand in both of his, looking directly into her eyes. Catherine, I promise you that nothing will happen to you or this baby on my watch. But if the unthinkable occurs, then Yesai will raise this child as my own, and they will never want for love or protection. Catherine squeezed his hand. Thank you for everything. You've given me more kindness than I ever thought I'd see again. Catherine another. Contraction hit, stronger than any before, and Catherine bore down with a strength that amazed Samuel. And then, in the gray light of dawn, David Morrison's child entered the world, a tiny, perfect daughter with dark hair and her mother's green eyes. She's beautiful, Samuel breathed, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket and placing her in Catherine's arms. Catherine, she's perfect. Catherine looked down at her daughter with tears of joy streaming down her face. Hello, sweetheart. She whispered, I'm your mama. And this is Samuel, he helped bring you into the world. The baby opened her eyes, those familiar green eyes, and seemed to focus on Samuel's face. Without hesitation, Samuel reached out and gently touched the tiny hand that was waving in the air. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "Welcome home." And in that moment, but Catherine still spoke of leaving come spring, of finding her own way in the world. And Samuel, despite the love he felt growing stronger each day, had given his word that he wouldn't try to stop her. The test came on a warm day in April, when a stranger rode up to the ranch house and asked to speak with Catherine. Samuel was working in the barn when he heard voices, and something in the tone made him pause in his work. "Mrs. Grimsby," the man was saying. "Or is it Miss Whitman now? I'm afraid I'm not sure of the proper address." "It's Miss Whitman," Catherine replied carefully. "Catherine Whitman, and you are?" "My name is Thomas Hartwell. I'm an attorney from San Antonio. I've been hired to find you on behalf of your late fiancé's family." Samuel felt his blood run cold. David Morrison's family. What could they want with Catherine after all this time? "I don't understand," Catherine said, and Samuel could hear the wariness in her voice. "Miss Whitman, I'm pleased to inform you that David Morrison's will has finally been settled. He left you a considerable inheritance, enough to ensure that you and your daughter would be financially secure for the rest of your lives." Samuel heard Catherine's sharp intake of breath. That's not possible. We weren't married. I have no legal claim, actually. You do." Mr. Morrison amended his will shortly before his death, specifically providing for you and any children you might have together. He was very thorough in his legal language. Samuel crept closer to the house, his heart hammering in his chest. Financial security. A fortune. Everything Catherine needed to build a life for herself and Grace far away from a lonely ranch, and a man who'd won her in a poker game. "How much?" Catherine asked quietly. The lawyer named a sum that made Samuel's knees go weak. It was more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of ranching. More than enough to buy Catherine freedom from any dependence on his charity. "There are some papers to sign," the lawyer continued, "and arrangements to be made for the transfer of funds. I can handle everything if you'd like to come back to San Antonio with me." I need time to think," Catherine said. "Of course, I'll be staying at the hotel in town for a few days. But Miss Whitman, I should mention that there's one condition to the inheritance." Samuel held his breath. "Mr. Morrison's family is eager to meet their granddaughter. They've requested that you bring the child to live in San Antonio, where she can be raised with all the advantages their wealth can provide. They're prepared to welcome both of you into the family." Samuel felt as if he'd been kicked in the chest by a horse. David Morrison's family. Grace's real family. People who could give her everything Samuel never could: education, culture, opportunities, beyond anything a small ranch could offer. Of course Catherine would go. How could she not? That evening, Catherine was unusually quiet during dinner. Grace slept peacefully in the cradle Samuel had made for her, unaware that her world was about to change forever. "When will you leave?" Samuel asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Catherine looked up from her untouched plate. "What makes you think I'm leaving? Catherine, don't make this harder than it has to be. You've been given a chance at a real life security, family, everything you and Grace need. I won't stand in your way." "What if I don't want to go?" Samuel stared at her. "What?" Catherine pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the hills that had become home to her. "What if I said I'd rather stay here on this ranch with you?" Samuel's heart leaped, then immediately crashed back down. "Catherine, you can't mean that. Think about Grace. Think about the opportunities she'd have, the life she could live." "I am thinking about Grace," Catherine said, turning to face him. "I'm thinking about raising her in a place where she's loved for who she is, not what she represents. I'm thinking about giving her a father who chose to love her before she was even born." "Catherine, Samuel, do you love me?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Samuel closed his eyes, fighting against